Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining today's training on preventing crises and resettlement, de-escalation with a trauma awareness. This training is presented by Switchboard, which is a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States. My name is Meg Gibbon and I'm Switchboard's Deputy Director. I'm joined by a co-host today, Rebecca Mulqueen, who's Switchboard's Administration and IT Manager. You'll be hearing from Rebecca in the chat throughout today's training. I want to start by mentioning that today's training is going to run for about 1 hour and 15 minutes and that it is being recorded. So the recording will be posted on the Switchboard website and you'll be emailed a link to the recording in exactly 24 hours. The webinar transcript will also be posted on our site in the next few days. Let's quickly take a look at some logistics in Zoom before diving in. All attendees are currently muted. If you need to switch between the phone or computer audio at any time, you'll find that information under audio settings in the bottom left. We'd really welcome your comments, your questions throughout today's session. Please don't hesitate to send those through. You can do that by clicking the chat bubble icon in the bottom center of your screen to open up the chat. If you send your chat message to all panelists and all attendees, everyone present today will be able to view the message. So to test that out now, I'd like to ask that if you are participating in today's training with more than one colleague, but you're using a single computer, if you're in a boardroom type of setting, if you could please type your names and your organization into the chat, then we'll know who's joining today. If you'd like to speak your question aloud during our dedicated Q&A period at the end, you can click the hand icon in the bottom center of your screen. And once you do that, we'll give you permission to unmute your own line, and then you can ask your question. At this point, I'm so pleased to turn it over to today's facilitators. We're joined today by Beth Farmer, Senior Technical Advisor for Safety, Education, and Wellness at the IRC, and by Sasha Verbillis-Kolp, an independent consultant. Beth and Sasha are both licensed clinical social workers with extensive experience providing trauma-informed case management and mental health services to refugees, survivors of torture, and other vulnerable populations. Over to you, Beth.
Thank you so much, Meg and Rebecca. I'm so pleased to be able to be here today. Just to get us started, I wanted to go over the objectives for today. So we're going to quickly review the last Switchboard presentation on the foundations of trauma-informed care with a special eye towards how a history of trauma, especially trauma that's been of high intensity and that may have been frequent in nature, can predispose someone to become more quickly frustrated, angry, or upset. We'll also explore some ways we can hopefully prevent these types of situations, as well as look at some techniques and skills that can be helpful in resolving these situations. So as stated before, this de-escalation training is part 2 of Switchboard's trauma-informed care trainings. And so we're going to quickly start by reviewing the previous training that was just a week or 2 ago. So quick poll question. We'll start with what is trauma? I believe that you should have a box that's just popped up, and you can click any or all of the ones that you think identify what a traumatic event is or what is trauma.
Great, I just opened up that poll, Meg, here. I will leave the poll open for maybe 10-15 seconds, allowing everybody to respond. I just closed up those that poll question and shared the results out.
Thank you so much, Meg. As we go to the next slide, I think all of you all picked up really well on what the poll was trying to convey, is that what trauma is not one specific thing. There's not a list of things that are traumatic. There's a lot of different things that can be traumatic to different people in different ways, but trauma does seem to have some common elements. These types of events tend to be outside of what would be considered normal life. They tend to be very disturbing or frightening. Often they're violent, or they have the potential to become violent. People often feel helpless, overwhelmed, sometimes even trapped. And all of these events impact people's emotions, bodies, sometimes their meaning of the world or the way they see the world, sometimes even their spirituality. These consequences can be short in nature, or they can last for a very long time. Traumatic impacts do tend to be dose dependent, meaning the more intense the trauma, the more frequent it is, and over the longer period of time it occurs, the more likely you are to have long-standing traumatic impacts. So what people consider traumatic, how traumatic it is to them, and the impact that it has on them is as individual as people themselves. Two people can be in the same event and experience it very differently. Two people in the same family can experience the same event and experience it very differently. I worked with asylum seekers recently from that were two sisters, and the older sister experienced the exact same events. They were much more traumatic for her than the younger sister. And one of the reasons is she said, I shielded my younger sister from all of these traumatic events. She muted their impact. So even though two people, even in the same family, can be in the same place, same time, and experience the same thing, it can have very different impacts on them. So we're quickly going to go over some of the principles of trauma-informed care that we did in the last training, and that's because these same principles hold true when we look at de-escalation. There's safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, mutuality and collaboration, and empowerment and choice. Now, as I mentioned in the last training, it's important to remember that these principles of trauma-informed care are not because people who've been through trauma need special treatment or because they are broken in some sort of way. In fact, the exact opposite is true. Our clients that we have the privilege of serving are very resilient and strong. But what trauma-informed care does recognize is that when people have been through trauma, especially if it was severe, repeated, or occurred over a longer period of time, then certain areas like safety, trustworthiness, choice, these areas have been eroded, and we may have to do more work on our part as staff members, as direct service providers, to try to restore them. We may have to work in different ways because these areas have been eroded. You can imagine that when somebody has come through a war zone, that their sense of safety is going to be very diminished. If they lived in a very repressive, under a very repressive regime, their sense of choice has been eroded. If they lived in a place that there was a lot of informing on each other, then their sense of trustworthiness has been eroded. So this changes how we have to work with people who have been through these types of events. So just as a quick reminder, and this is really, really central to why we talk about de-escalation and why de-escalation and trauma, or I should say escalation and trauma, and the principles of trauma-informed care, the nexus between all these things, is because trauma, when we experience trauma, our bodies do certain things automatically. They are designed to keep us alive. We have this automated response when we feel threatened. And by automated, what I mean is it's a response that we don't think about. It happens. It's hardwired into our body. No one experiences a very violent sudden event and says, I wonder how I should respond to this. Should I run? Should I stay here? It's hardwired into the body, and this response is automatic. So before, during, and immediately after a traumatic event, when threatened, our bodies release hormones to increase our energy and our speed. Blood rushes to our major muscle groups, including the heart, which beats much more rapidly. Breathing becomes shallow. Again, all of this is done to help us fight, run away, and in more rare cases, even freeze so we can hide. And if we have a single incident, a single traumatic event, and our life is stable and predictable and nothing else happens, over time, most of the time, our brains and our bodies return to balance. However, when we have multiple repeated incidents, especially if they occur over a long period of time, our brains and our bodies perceive the world as an unsafe place, and they adapt to the world as an unsafe place. That means that the slightest trigger or even perceived threat can cause the brain and the body to have this fight, flight, freeze response. And in an unsafe situation, this is very protective. But when we're having these types of responses in a safe situation, it can make regular life much more difficult and get in the way. It can also cause us to respond in more acute and more intense ways and become angry, upset, or frustrated more quickly, or even misperceive things as threatening when they're not. And now I'll turn it over to Sasha.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today with everyone at Switchboard and with Beth. I'll be moving through this next section with everyone. We'll look at some specific terms related to escalation, de-escalation, and crisis, and then we'll explore applying them to a different case example and think more about both preventative and response-oriented services. So I just invite you to think for a moment and question this, if you will. Have you ever been in a situation where a client appeared to be overreacting, difficult, or unreasonable, but trauma awareness helped you to see the situation differently? If so, what were some of the things that you did that helped to diffuse the situation, and what did you do to help support the client in returning to a state of calm? Maybe you can be reflecting on that as we move through this next section. As Beth spoke about, both our bodies and our minds will naturally respond with a trauma response when handling certain situations. This may sometimes appear like a crisis, or in escalated moments, we may have this natural trauma response. The reason for this is that, as Beth already spoke about, is that we can get activated. The body can be just primed to respond in this way. So while this is happening, there's also new opportunities for us to work with that response in a way that doesn't further escalate situations and hopefully is helpful in containing what may be occurring. So something to be very clear about in this training is that this is really to provide tips on preventing and de-escalating non-emergency situations. That's where clients may feel upset, frustrated, overwhelmed, or angry. It's not a training to describe how to handle emergencies or safety and security threats. We really recommend that every organization have a safety and security plan in place, and that all staff should be trained on that plan. If a client certainly exhibits violence, is threatening the staff or themselves in any way, you should know how to seek the appropriate help immediately. That may include calling a crisis line or other emergency services as needed. So it's helpful to distinguish these different terms. We have escalation, de-escalation, and crisis. Escalation is used to describe when situations where a person's thoughts, feelings, and emotions may overwhelm them and make it really hard for them to cope, listen, or to act effectively. When someone's escalated, it may or may not be a crisis. Some examples might be they could have agitated speech, they could be pacing, there could be physical or verbal cues that indicate something's getting more escalated. Again, it's just this heightened sense of agitation that you may be observing in your client. De-escalation, in contrast, is a term that we're using when somebody moves from that very heightened state back to a more balanced or homeostasis sort of state. They're better able to cope and listen, and they can act more effectively. De-escalation, sometimes I like to think of it as this expression of returning to calm. Some people may refer to this as like literally the mind and body having the ability to have this calming of the nervous system. And perhaps there's a trigger or something else that has happened that will allow the person to then access the more executive functionings of their brain and take in new information and new learnings and apply them appropriately. A crisis, in contrast, is this time of intense difficulty that may impact the individual's ability to cope. Sometimes this can put them at risk to themselves or to others. It can be associated with anything in a person's life. It can be their finances, housing situation, their relationships with others, their general sense of safety, how employment services are going. Maybe it's even hearing bad news from home. Oftentimes, people may move through different phases of a life cycle related to crisis, like the one that is visualized here in our presentation. There may be different types of triggers or warning signs that could suggest a situation may move through a cycle like this. As you are privileged to work alongside your client, it may be helpful for you to identify where they may be at on a life cycle like this. It could be very empowering for them to know where they're at as well if they continue to have repeated moments of escalation that are occurring in their lives. The cycle does represent these periods of dysregulation. That's when somebody gets escalated and they then may proceed more to that sense of a severe like crisis. And the first and foremost priority for us is to implement some of those trauma-informed care principles Beth spoke to, namely that of safety. Once the situation is contained and things have begun to calm down, a person enters what we call a restoration phase. This is the phase where new information, new ways of being, a heightened sense of self-awareness may emerge. Similarly, after that stage, we have an opportunity for some follow-up. This follow-up is both with the client, so there's some teachable moments about what has occurred for them about their particular crisis, but also for staff in terms of how staff were able to manage a particular escalated situation and what worked well and what maybe didn't work well and what could be done differently in the future. These are all ultimately preventative approaches that hopefully support the client and your agency in better managing these types of situations with a very robust trauma awareness. I'll move now into our sort of next section where we continue to explore these ideas of escalation and crisis from the lens of really having what I would call both preventative and response-oriented case management processes. So here we have a wonderful case example of a young Oromo or transition age youth Oromo client that I had worked with many years ago as a resettlement caseworker in Denver, Colorado. So Ibo is an 18-year-old Oromo youth. He's a single client whose non-biological anchor family abandons him. He has what we think are symptoms of PTSD, and he has had frequent encounters with law enforcement, both in Denver, Colorado, but also while he had lived in exile in Kenya. He maintains a very trusting relationship with his caseworker, and he frequently talks to her about his life and about his feelings that he's having while interacting in the resettlement. He's now in a current situation of facing homelessness. He's about to enter a crisis, yet his situation has not yet escalated. So let's keep this case in mind as we move through some of these ideas related to de-escalation skills we're going to share. Preventing situations of escalation really requires us as caseworkers and other persons within the service provider network arena, depending upon your role and your capacity, to really engage in ongoing screening and assessment of your clients' vulnerabilities and risk factors. Keep in mind that some clients may have very different risk levels that may require our ongoing monitoring and status checks. Some people may have disproportionate challenges or issues at face. They may have more complex medical issues. They may be living with a disability. There could be a single parent household. There could be other things that are occurring that make them more at risk. And these different areas of their life and their life domains and how they're situated in their environment are less thriving. There are certain things that are happening in these particular domains that will frequently require us to check in on things. So in Ivo's case, he's about ready to face homelessness. So his immediate sense of housing and stability is not thriving, it is at risk. So we're looking at that. We want to include that as a part of an ongoing and continuous assessment process while we're working with somebody through case management. Importantly, what you may perceive to be a challenge may or not be for the client. That's why it's really important, to the best of our abilities, to have our clients guiding and informing this process. That's inviting in mutuality and empowerment through the trauma-informed care principles. We have this opportunity to work towards taking somebody from an unstable place to a more thriving place. So the goal with Ivo is to start with his housing so that he can become more stabilized and contained in that particular life domain. Sometimes survivors of trauma may need some support about recognizing that some of these areas are more vulnerable or at risk for them. In contrast, or sort of another layer to this I want to introduce, is that a part of any sort of service plan that you may have with a client, as Beth mentioned earlier, you're going to be looking at how intense and how frequent and how long has something been happening for them that may be causing certain risk areas or vulnerability for them. So for example, there could be some different emotional or behavioral like symptoms that you're seeing that could be leading up to a crisis-like situation. Some people may present with like a sense of panic. They may display a low threshold for frustration. There could be a sense that they feel out of control. Or in contrast, you could have somebody that's very shut down or unable to vocalize or talk about what's happening with them, and more or less may present kind of with a sense of being frozen. They could have a lot of extreme sadness. These are the different types of symptoms on the psychological or emotional level that you may be looking at and maybe wanting to revisit throughout your care with a client. I want to mention that these types of vulnerabilities and symptoms that you may see and are continuously screening for may look very different in youth than it does in adults. Therefore, we should respond and screen for vulnerabilities at age and developmentally appropriate stages. For example, with the youth, we can certainly be very interested in how things are going both in their home and in their school lives. School-age children in particular may experience developmentally appropriate moments and expressions of frustration that are, kind of commonplace for their particular age. I would just like to encourage people to be aware of those differences. We may have time to talk about that a little bit later, but anytime that you may be concerned about some of the behavior you're hearing about or sensing with a child, that just to note that it could be very developmentally appropriate, but it could also be a problem area. So I had mentioned earlier 2 areas that are important as we're looking at preventative and response-oriented support for our clients that may experience escalated moments or crises. Is this very first one, which is around helping clients to identify their triggers. Now, triggers are symbolic events. They can be physical places. They can be sounds, smells. They may be a specific memory, something that could cause someone to feel escalated And in that escalation, they may exhibit some of the same types of behaviors and natural responses as that trauma response. It could be the sound of a car backfiring. It could be skipping a meal or forgetting to take a medication. Some of these may be enough that that trauma response can get activated in the person. Now, if you're seeing this happen in someone in the moment, the very most important thing to do as best as we all can is to embrace that sense of safety. So I like to use the following mantra, which is, what is it that this client needs right now to feel safe and heard and validated? So caseworkers have this opportunity to genuinely meet this person with a sense of presence and receptivity, non-judgment, and perhaps being able to mirror a sense of calm that will help them down-regulate their dysregulation. And that's really key, because if you meet somebody that's actively triggered and super activated and you respond by matching that energy, the whole situation can just spiral real out of control real quick. So we want to try and not do that, right? We want to really try and contain that. And over time, when the client is not in a current escalated moment and they may be more at that restoration stage, we can help the client identify and name various triggers. This can be super empowering for people. This is often something a clinician might do in a clinical setting with someone. Later, Beth will explore some more concrete verbal and nonverbal statements and responses that can help you. These are these skills that can help you when you manage a moment of a client being triggered. This could include supporting them in seeking support, nurturing practices like deep breathing, other things that can, again, help to soothe that nervous system. Recently, and this is a little different, but in a trauma workshop that I did with veterans, we intentionally, for an experience, we decided to use herbs such as lavender and peppermint that could help soothe and calm the nervous system while we began to talk about difficult trauma-related memories. There's a lot of different techniques out there that can help in the moment, but the point is that you will begin to see how this can be teachable and instructive for the client and for yourself. Similarly, when we're identifying triggers, it's super important that we learn to identify our own triggers, because at times we can have a dysregulated or affected moment as a caseworker. And these instances, again, may occur just as a natural reaction to the heightened situation the client is facing. So trauma-informed supervision, care in those moments, knowing how to step out and away and get extra help if you need it is really important. And similar to really take care of yourself and have those supportive colleagues and a set of immediate actions that you can implement that are helpful. You can always come back to this and learn more about it after a crisis or escalated situation happens. And lastly, the last thing I want to say about this related to triggers, back on the last slide, is that some of your own personal triggers may have a lot to do with your own background and experiences, as well as your gender, your culture, and communication styles and whatnot. So thank you. We can go ahead and move to that next slide on early warning signs. So in contrast to triggers, we have early warning signs. These are the signs that can help a client know that he or she is moving towards escalation or crisis. So these are things leading up to that type of moment. Clients can recognize the signs by examining the hours, the days before a previous crisis has occurred. These could be certain events, emotions, reactions that led up to the specific event. The goal is that the client is able to identify at the earliest possible moment sort of what their emotional state was like, what their experiences were feeling like before that, so that hopefully they can garner some new skills and awareness to help make some of those crisis situations much less and less heightened in the future. This allows them to employ coping skills and strategies much earlier on when the situation is less severe and easier to contain. Another way to think about it is for people to identify those precipitating events and their physical and emotional reactions.
Great, thanks, Sasha. You guys all just heard Sasha talk through helping clients to identify potential triggers and potential warning signs. So we wanted to sort of test your understanding of what she just reviewed, and we have a few examples here. So in the chat, do you think this example here, anniversary of a loved one's death, would that be a potential trigger or a potential warning sign? Great, I think everyone's saying trigger, exactly. So that one would be a potential trigger.
Yeah.
How about irritability and crying easily? Is that a potential warning sign or a potential trigger? So on this one, we saw a few different answers, but the vast majority mentioned that this one is a warning sign, which is correct. And then last one, potential trigger or potential warning sign, spending too much time watching the news. And on this one, definitely a mix as well. So it looks like some people saying both, some people saying warning sign or trigger. For us, we thought that this would likely correspond to a trigger. But Sasha, would you like to speak a bit more about this one?
Sure. I think the way we think about that is that exposing oneself to repeated images that could be distressing or reminding someone of bad things on the news could certainly then trigger someone. And I think that's probably the best way to think about that. And the one previously that are very clearly symptoms, I think that that's a really good way to distinguish warning signs from triggers. Again, because there's a certain set of types of notable behaviors and reactions occurring prior to something happening, prior to becoming maybe triggered or prior to an escalated moment.
I see an interesting response in the chat that the news itself might be a trigger, but the behavior of watching something too much could potentially be a warning sign. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
That's a great way to think about it. That is a very good way to think about it.
Thanks, Sarah, for that comment. Thanks, everyone, for participating in this as well.
So as we're looking at these preventative practices, we're looking at proactively and collaboratively planning with our client who may be at risk. So we're including them in this process. They're identifying their resources, their strengths, and coping strategies alongside you with your case management services. Planning should respond to that severity of risk, right? So for example, a plan for a client who may be unable to pay their rent in a couple of weeks could include a lot of frequent sessions and collaboration with different housing providers. Planning for a client who's at risk of suicide could both include a safety plan, which is really a step-by-step plan for how to keep oneself safe. They're preventative. They help to manage situations before they arise and help the client be able to identify what's most helpful to prevent some of those risks from escalating. In contrast, a crisis plan is the plan for what to do if the client can no longer keep themselves safe. So I really wanted to distinguish the two. And in some settings, people may oftentimes lump the two together, and they're actually a little bit different. So again, a crisis plan is the things that you do in the moment if things have gotten too far and escalated and a safety concern is occurring. In any case, we're looking to remain trauma sensitive. We're discussing the plans in a way that is not shameful or diminishing to the survivor's unique healing and journey. It's also important for us to remember and discuss the limits of confidentiality with this. You can also think about what you can do to help the client work with those triggers and warning signs on a regular basis so that they can work towards maintaining wellness. These could be short-term, like daily practices. They could be weekly, or they could be monthly types of self-care activities that they're engaged in. And really, you could generate that wellness action plan with them by practicing the coping skills and modeling them and checking in on them frequently to help reduce some of those symptoms to prevent future crises from happening. As we think about encouraging different coping skills and strategies, we know that this is taught both in resettlement integration services, but it's also taught through specialized mental health and psychosocial services, and it can be a routine part of your care. whatever setting you're in some capacity. So you can help clients explore what they've done in the past to help themselves cope and ease with distress. So as I think about the refugee experience and the resiliency and strength and the post-traumatic growth that may happen for some, is that people have overcome and gone through many challenges and crises. So I think it's helpful to always remember that and invite that and recognize that there have been adverse experiences that people have already weathered, that they have developed some coping and other strategies that have gotten them through. Those are things that you can tap into. And really that's a privilege that we get to have working alongside survivors, is to find out what some of those are. We can help them to strategize about those, maybe introduce some new ones. There are many potential ways to identify these. These will most certainly include faith orientation, spirituality, connection, social connection. That is a huge fabric that is often eroded as well for people. And that's something that we can help to restore in our casework and coping strategy support, as well as supporting cultural practices, leveraging different strengths, and addressing, of course, all those concrete basic needs. How are things going in their housing? How are they handling looking for work? Are there new opportunities that are coming in one's future? Are they able to seek help? Remembering our case example with Ivo, who his current situation is that he needs to have some stable housing, but over time, he may greatly benefit from receiving treatment for symptoms related to post-traumatic stress. So as we go back to Ivo's situation, as I had alluded to before, we can see that we have tapped into his strengths by working to connect him in the community. So what ended up happening here with Ivo is that we worked to find him a well-respected faith leader in the Oromo community that he connected with. He was really seeking a mentor. He was really seeking some connection with somebody that he could trust. And ultimately, he was able to go and live with that individual. And over the long term, working alongside his caseworker, he was able to create a longer term safety plan, as well as he identified different strategies of what he could do when and where when he was feeling triggered. For example, anytime he saw an authority figure or a police officer, he would immediately get very activated. Similarly, if he was out walking after night. So we were able to talk about the things that he could do, and eventually we introduced support for him for his emotional health and well-being for treatment for PTSD.
Thanks for that, Sasha. This is Meg just chiming in. I saw a question on this, just so everyone's aware. While it's a real case Sasha's talking about, the name and photo have, of course, been changed.
So this is Beth again, and I'm going to talk a little bit about now what happens when our preventative measures have not been successful or don't work. I think it, as Sasha said, just as a quick summary, ideally we're in a place that we're working with people long term. We're able to talk to them about their natural coping strategies. We can introduce other strategies. We can talk to them about triggers and warning signs, and that we've got that luxury of long-term engagement and prevention. Unfortunately, that doesn't always, even if we do that, it's not always successful every time. And sometimes we just simply don't have that luxury. So we're going to slip a little bit into how we best support clients when they're angry, upset, and frustrated. So in the next section, we're going to talk about trauma-informed de-escalation techniques that will hopefully calm the situation down and set the stage for that restoration that Sasha talked about, for things like problem solving. If we know the person and we've talked to them about coping skills, going back to those coping skills. But for a more that some more effective communication and next steps can occur. Many of the skills we'll cover stem from other communication based skills that you already probably know, like active or mindful listening, summarizing, paraphrasing, validation. We're going to talk a lot about validation. You might be familiar with other approaches that incorporate some of these skills, such as mental health first aid, motivational interviewing, psychological first aid. Regardless of what framework you use, my hope is that you'll reflect on these de-escalation skills and be open to techniques that may feel new or different depending on your own style of communication. And just remember that de-escalation is a skill that is developed over time, that can be learned, and that it is a practice that, as I said before, you get better with over time, the more time you do it. So one of Switchboard's goals is to promote evidence-based practices wherever possible. And this means practices where there's been some research to suggest and prove they're effective. So the skills that we are going to talk about next really draw on the recommendations from this research base. And I flagged one article here for further reading if you're interested. It'll be posted in the chat. It examines some of the core components of successful de-escalation techniques that have actually been studied. And Switchboard, I believe, will be sending a copy by email after this training as well. So let's say someone is escalated. What do you do? The very first thing that you want to do is kind of attend to you. If you are escalated or feel yourself getting escalated at all, you really want to calm your own body. Take some deep breaths. Work on kind of centering yourself and getting into a more calm headspace. If you have just had a really horrific day, and you do not feel that this is possible for you at this time, see if there's somebody else that can engage with the client. Don't raise your voice, even if the client raises his or her voice. You want to be, as Sasha said, that mirror for what you want to happen, that returning to calm. You want to model that. Give the client physical space so they don't feel trapped or cornered. And also for your own safety, if you're talking closely, take a step back. That can be helpful. If you're in a small space, can you safely move to a bigger space? If there are other people present, can you move to a more private space? Now, this is not always wise, because if the person is very escalated, you may not want to be trapped in a room with this person. That may feel less safe. Can you then move into a lobby, or can you move other people that are present into another space to ensure that sort of privacy? So having that air and space around the person is really important. The other thing is you don't want to touch the person. This can be perceived as threatening, or even be felt like a violation of their space when they're very activated, or even feel very inappropriate. This is true for children as well. Oftentimes, because children are smaller or when they're upset, the natural tendency may be to go and touch them. And that may be okay for a caregiver, depending on the child. But for somebody who is not a caregiver, you really don't want to touch somebody when they are escalated. Once you've given the person space, once you have managed to kind of calm and get into this centered, calm space, think about your own body and how you may be presenting yourself. Don't cross your arms or put your hands on your hip. You want to project to that person both with the way you talk, but also with your body language, that sense of calmness, that sense of caring, that sense of trustworthiness. Try to switch from whatever mode you are in. Like if you were in a problem-solving mode, if you were talking to this person, relaying information, if you were in this other mode and then things start to get escalated, you're going to need to switch the mode you're in. You're not going to continue to problem solve. You're not going to continue to share information. You're going to get into just attending to that escalation and de-escalation. You want to start to slow things way down. Start to go from a talking mode into a listening mode. If there's one thing that is my mantra when I'm working with people that are angry or upset, is to talk less and listen more. And that's something that is a mantra for me that I have to attend to all the time anyway. But that talk less and listen more is critical in de-escalation. Don't forget that when people are escalating, they're upset, that brain-body reaction is turned on, and that front part of the brain that is kind of that problem solving is kind of powered down, and a lot of the activity in the client's brain is in the back part of that brain, which is more automatic and instinctual. So any information that you're sharing right now probably is not going to be retained. The brain's ability to engage in problem solving is just not there at that time. If you are doing this with the client as well, and I talked before about maybe thinking, am I the right person to do this at the right time? Sometimes you may be engaging in this for a while and you feel yourself start to get escalated. You start to lose it. If you can't calm down, in my work, the colleagues and I, we call it tap out. We kind of tap out and have somebody else take over and manage, because it's really important that you're able to not only be calm, but maintain calm. And that also means that if you absolutely can't slow down and attend to this right now because you have another critical appointment, it may be someone else that needs to do this de-escalation. And the last thing I'll say on this slide before we go into some more techniques is, I had people ask in the last training that I did, and I thought it was just an amazing question, is how do I know if somebody's really angry or if this is just a cultural style of communication? Now, this is a great question, and this is less likely to be a question if you've worked with the client over a longer period of time and you know that person and you know their personality. It's also less likely to be a question if you've worked with a lot of people from that country and culture and you kind of have a bell curve of a normal style of communication. However, if you are wondering, if you don't know this person or you don't know them well, or you think there may be a cultural component, I think you can always ask before engaging in de-escalation. You can always say, I know people communicate in many different ways, and I'm wondering if you're upset, because if you are, I want to listen and understand what's going on. And so you give people the option of opting in to that or opting out of that in a warm and compassionate way. So if you're wondering about it, I think it's okay to ask. So the first part of all de-escalation, in my view, and the most important part, is validation. Validation is really, it gets to that human core of who we are, which is we want to be seen, we want to be heard. we know developmentally all children go through a stage, the look at me stage, right? It's just a normal part of that human condition. And we want to feel like we matter, and we want to feel like other people understand us. And the key part of validation is really actively listening, and actively listening without judgment. Now that's really hard because we all have judgments, and judgments aren't necessarily good or bad. But if a judgment comes in, kind of in those mindfulness techniques, we just want to see it almost kind of pass away. We want to be in this very neutral space, and we want to be paying attention to the person. So one of the first key elements of validation is that you're present for the person, that you're paying attention for the person. Validation shows the client that you're interested, that you're listening, that you empathize, that you either understand or you're trying to understand. Now, validation, especially verbal validation, does not mean you have to agree with the person. When I learned, for those of you all who've done dialectical behavioral therapy, gone through some training with DBT, and you will have people that you need to validate that may be saying things to you that are very, very inaccurate, and you're not required to validate inaccuracy or things that are just flat out wrong, which is often why you can validate feelings. You can validate the thing under the thing, as it were. You can say things like, I can see how you could feel frustrated by that, or I can see how frustrated you are. You can also search for the things in what the person is saying. You don't have to validate their behavior in the moment, especially if it's inappropriate. But you can validate the things that are true about what they're saying, if there are things that are true. For instance, let's say somebody was an hour late for their appointment, and you can't see them. And I think we'll go over this in a case later, and they're very angry, and they come in and they say, they're pounding their hand. You can say, it is really frustrating to have your bus be late and miss your appointment. That is true. That is authentic. And you want to, the other thing I would say is that is really important, both with the way that you're engaging with the client and with your statements, is to be real and authentic with it. It has to be real and authentic, or people, especially in that heightened state, they can really pick up on those underlying nuances, and they know when something's false, and it can escalate them more. I think we've all seen pictures of, let's say, a policeman who stopped a person maybe who's speeding, and they're saying all the right things about ma'am, and they're asking for stuff politely, but underneath that is an inauthenticness that can be deeply, deeply dissonant with what they're saying, and it can increase frustration. So it's really important that as you say stuff, it doesn't sound rote, that it is very authentic. You want to keep your responses very simple, focusing on the here and now. If you ask questions, keep them very simple. What's the most helpful thing I can do today? You want to really put off problem solving until people are calmer. When they're overwhelmed, they're not able to take in a lot of information or access that decision-making part of their brain. And so you want to provide much less information. Facts are not your friend in this moment. You want to ask a lot fewer questions, and the questions you ask need to be very simple and contained to the immediate problem, not what needs to happen next week. Excuse me. And sometimes when people are in this heightened state, they'll ask rhetorical questions or say things that are designed to provoke. It's really important that you don't get drawn into that you really focus on keeping the situation calm. So if somebody says, everybody here is so incompetent at their job, you don't respond by saying, that's not true. We have a lot of people here who have master's degrees. That's not what you want to do. Or they've been doing this work for 15 years. You want to respond with, I can hear how frustrated you are. You want to respond to the thing under the thing. You don't want to get drawn into that conflict, or else things will be much more escalated. And you want to, as you respond, when you're responding, focus on what you can do and not on what you can't do. So an example would be, let's say that somebody calls the front desk and they've called 15 times and their caseworker is not in. By repeating over and over again, the caseworker's not in, especially as the person is getting more and more escalated, you're really focusing on what you can't do. But by focusing on what you can do, what I can do is I can take a message, and as soon as they come in, I can hand them this message. What I can do is help you find someone else. Or for instance, instead of saying, there's no appointments until next week, you can say, I can get you the first available appointment. So it's a little bit of a word switch, but it starts to turn the tide and be more problem solving and focus oriented. So now we're going to go to a case example. So I talked about this a little bit before, but let's say Najma misses an appointment. She arrives an hour late, and Louis, the front desk staff person, tells her that her caseworker is now with another client and cannot see her. And Najma insists that she has to see her caseworker now to work on her housing applications. So perceiving that the situation is not an emergency, Louis says there's no appointments available that day. There's just no appointments today. And the client gets increasingly distressed. Her voice begins to rise. She shouts, it's not my fault. The bus was late and now you won't even help me. I'm not leaving until I see my caseworker. And Louis starts to feel a sense of panic. And he's noticeably agitated. He starts to worry about, how do I respond? He isn't sure what to do. What are some de-escalation skills that you all, or that any caseworker, can use in this situation?
So you can type your responses to this question into the chat. Feel free to send your response to all panelists and all attendees so that everybody can see what you have to say. And then we can discuss a few of your replies. Great, so Paula suggests validating her feelings. A few similar responses as well. Validate feelings of frustration. Focus on what you can do. Find something that can be done today. I can check with the caseworker about availability.
These are great responses, and I'm seeing all of those come in. I think that they're all right. You want to have Louis, if he can, take a deep breath, relax his body and his language, and really work on kind of finding that place of center and calm. He can listen, right, and respond with that validation, because when it's not your fault and you miss your appointment and there's something that really matters to you, it's not just about being late, right? She's worried about her housing. Her housing is the roof over her head. Her housing is what keeps her safe. That's a big deal, right? So recognizing that it's not about a missed appointment. It's not about a bus. Those are kind of representations of this bigger, very scary thing. So validating by saying Sounds like it has been a really frustrating day. It's hard when you've tried to get somewhere and the bus is late, and you wait for that moment where you start to see a break in the conversation, and then you can perhaps say at that point in time, offer what you can do. Would it be helpful if I went to see if another caseworker is available at this time? Would you like to wait here and see if I can find somebody else to help with your housing applications? This may depend on what you can or can't do in the situation. You could also ask some questions to assess the severity, like when is this due? Because that can provide some opportunity for reassurance. If they say it's due in 2 weeks, you may be able to offer reassurance. Even if no one is available at this moment today, I can assure you that we will address it before this is due. Or if it's due that day, you might be able to, because it's a very important, it's got a deadline attached to it, you might be able to push somebody to attend to it to make space on their calendar first. But it's only after Najma is calmer that we can ask these next questions.
Thanks everyone for participating in this. Some great responses if you all want to read through the chat and hear what your fellow participants had to say.
So after any crisis or escalated situations, it's always a good idea to debrief with staff, even if it's a short debrief or a longer debrief. And depending on the level of escalation and crisis, kind of dictates how long that debrief should be. If it was a significant escalation or significant crisis, you're going to want to have more time for that debrief. As a supervisor, it's a really good opportunity for you to praise these solid, good skills that you saw staff demonstrate that were helpful in any situation that you want to see repeated. It's also a good way to identify places where there may be additional training needs for individual staff, or you may need to look now at this client's care, depending on the situation, and see if there's additional resources or case planning that may be needed. Is it a time where you may need to put a safety plan or crisis plan in place? Do we need to refer the client to additional supports? Is it an outlier situation or is it more pervasive? So there's always a good reflection point, whether it be short or long, after an escalation or a crisis. And the last thing I'll say before moving on to questions is that this debriefing is also a way to encourage staff to share their feelings about what happened. And it's a good way to really prevent burnout and to help staff not feel alone. The vast majority of people on this call, I am certain, got into this profession because they wanted to help people, not for the money. And knowing that that debrief is also a recognition that this work can sometimes be hard and frustrating for them. It's also a time as a supervisor you can encourage staff to engage in self-care, or to, if they've come from traumatic backgrounds or similar backgrounds, to ask them how this may have affected them. If the situation was particularly scary or stressful, what do they need from you? What do they need from the agency? So even without active or supportive supervision, staff should know that these types of situations do cause reactions in the brain and body. It is hard to maintain calm when somebody is upset or angry or frustrated. You may need a few minutes before the next appointment. You may need a glass of water. You may need to take some deep breaths. That is going to be normal, and that caring for yourself is also a part of this practice.
Thank you so much for that, Beth. Just chiming in now to review a few recommended resources as we move into the Q&A. So there is an accompanying information guide for this training. So this guide includes the same content that Beth and Sasha just facilitated, but in a format that's designed to be downloadable, accessible, that you can print out or you can have as a reference. I saw a few questions looking for the presentation slides. We present this information guide in place of the slides because it's easier to have as a reference over time. We also have a similar guide for our previous webinar, Trauma-Informed Care Movement Towards Practice, from 2 weeks ago. So those are available to you, and Rebecca is dropping some resources into the chat as well. And we have the 2 recordings for these 2 trainings. This one will go up on our website shortly, and the one from 2 weeks ago is already on there. I wanted to mention technical assistance from Switchboard. So if you would like support in these areas related to your ORR-funded programs, we are able to provide customized training and TA to you, your organization. So please don't hesitate to reach out about support that goes beyond what we just discussed in the past 2 trainings. And then finally, some additional resources will come to you over email exactly 24 hours from now. So as I mentioned, Rebecca's dropping these into the chat. You have our website URL as well to find them sooner, but you'll also get an email right to your inbox with all this information tomorrow. All right, so with that, I will move into Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left in our time today. And I wanted to start with a question for Sasha related to serving youth. So you had touched on this at the beginning, and a question came in that said, we always hear that young people have not developed to a point that they're able to make executive decisions. Can you talk about what their executive reasoning looks like and how this can affect de-escalation?
So I think the comment, and I'll also invite Beth, she and I had been talking a little bit about some of these themes earlier, so I'll invite Beth to respond as well. I think the first question is to really look, or the first consideration that I think of is to look at where they're at developmentally, because, so there's certainly developmentally, but then there's also, there could be some other issues at play related to their cognitive development in general. So there could be a child that has ADHD that may have differences, neurotypical differences in their executive functioning, and they could be 11 or 18 and still have some challenges knowing how to downregulate and exercise executive functioning, right? That child may look different than somebody that is like 3 to 6, right? Because the 3 to 6 year old range, it's very commonplace for people or for kids at that age range to display challenges and how to access that sort of frontal lobe, that area of the brain that helps you to process information, calculate it, and then respond with what is expected and normal within sort of your peer or social environment. So I think the long and short of it is, if you're just interested in that executive functioning, and if we know that trauma is at play with some youth, that there can be some differences in how and when some of the behaviors will manifest, and to be really keen on looking at that from a sense of what is expected for normal youth development, but with a lens of that there may be some unique attributes based on what people have lived through, based on the type of trauma they've been exposed to. Beth, did you have any comments on that one as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some great de-escalation techniques for the classroom that are online that people can look up. Many of the same general principles are the same about giving space, wanting to be calm, don't touch. But the last thing I'll say with children, especially the younger they are, is you can anticipate escalation. That's just the name of the game. That's where they are developmentally. And so if you're working with children regularly, you want to have a plan for this ahead of time. You know, do you have an identified calm down area in the room? Are you incorporating, recognizing when you're getting upset into the into your curriculum? Are you helping people, children, recognize what it looks like in their body, helping them recognize what helps them, teaching them how to ask when they recognize that feeling, how to ask for a time out? You get this wonderful opportunity if you're working with kids over a longer period of time to really proactively engage around this issue.
Great. Thank you, Sasha and Beth. I'm seeing some great questions coming through, and in particular, a few people asked a question around interpreters. Maybe Beth, I'll direct this one to you. What advice do you have for working with interpreters when a client is in crisis, or in a situation where there's a language barrier but no interpreter is present?
Yeah, and I wish I had the perfect answer to this, because these situations, like the jobs you guys do, are really, really complex. I would say the foundation is hopefully every office has access to an interpretation service, just foundationally, that you could call and get on the phone if you really need to. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, telephonic interpretation is really hard, and it is not as good in general to in-person interpretation. And it doesn't mean that when you call that they necessarily have your language available. So I recognize that this isn't a foolproof type of solution. But I would say that if you do have language access available and the person is not so escalated that they can hear you, and sometimes there are those situations, but you have the space to say, we're going to be using an interpreter because I really want to understand everything that you're saying. It's important to me. But also sometimes when we use an interpreter, it makes the conversation more difficult and there can be more misunderstanding. So if you feel like I'm misunderstanding you or I'm not getting what you're saying, could you please let me know? So you kind of front load the conversation, recognizing that this is harder with an interpreter. And then what I would say is, if you don't have one there, it becomes very difficult, but you're going to rely on that positive presence, the validation that is not verbal, which is the nodding, the looking at the person in the eye if it's culturally appropriate, the sympathetic stance, until you see the things calm down. That may be the only thing you have at your disposal at that time, unfortunately.
Great. Thank you, Beth. Thanks everyone again for your continued questions. We have time for one or two more. I see we have a hand raised from Katie. Katie, I'm going to allow you to talk. You'll see a prompt that you can now unmute yourself on your screen. I can see that you're unmuted. You might be muted a second time on your mic because I can't hear you yet. All right, sounds like we might be having a little audio trouble there. Again, you are unmuted. You have the ability to talk. If you unmute yourself, maybe there's a button on your mic or on your headset that might be the problem. In the meantime, we'll take a question from the chat. So in a situation, and why don't I send this one over to Sasha. In a situation where a client is using abusive language, do you think it's appropriate to tell the client, we won't be able to continue speaking unless you stop using abusive language?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets at every caseworker and individual that responds to somebody using threatening language is going to have their own threshold of what is deemed appropriate and not. So I think it's perfectly fine to still validate someone's feelings. I think a good way to kind of deflect with that is to respond and say, I can see that you're really frustrated, so that you continually reframe it in a way that doesn't, introduce the possibility of further escalation and verbal explosion, if you will. If it continues to proceed in that way, then I think you're moving more into that crisis plan, because I think that if a person's safety, like the staff, the workforce safety is feeling threatened, then you need to take another step. That might mean taking a pause and saying to your client, you know, I'm going to be looking for some additional support so I can best meet the needs that you have today. And that gives the caseworker an opportunity to go and seek additional support and supervision to introduce the components that might be a part of that crisis plan. So I just want to say that even, and then this actually even relates to that interpreter question too. Let's say that that some of the, if you do have a live interpreter present and some of the language is happening, but the interpreter's not disclosing that to you, that's actually really important information. You would want to know that that is actually what the client is saying. So I think you kind of have to be prepared for everything. But the long and short of it is, if it leads in that direction, the staff is not feeling comfortable, they're feeling threatened in some way by the verbal language, by the physical cues that are happening with the client, then there is a very validating way to say, I can see that you're frustrated, but then there's also another way that that staff can get other support and have some sharing of duty care in response to the client. That's for workplace safety, that's for trauma-informed care. I think that's the best case scenario that we can do in that situation.
Great. Thank you so much, Sasha, and thanks everyone for your questions. I can see that there are several more, but we are at time for this training. So anyone whose question that we didn't have a chance to answer to live, we will do our best to send you a response over email. And you can also always submit a TA request to Switchboard, which I'll touch on very quickly next. Before I get there, I wanted to review today's learning objectives because you'll be prompted to complete a feedback survey after closing today's webinar. It may be open already in your browser and the link is now in the chat. We're hoping that you can tell us in that survey if you feel we achieved the objectives, that after today's session, you can describe how trauma can contribute to escalation in crisis situations. You can name steps you can take to prevent escalation or those crisis situations, and that you can name de-escalation skills you can take in trauma-informed crisis intervention. So that feedback survey is hugely important to us. It's very short, just 1 minute of your time makes a big difference to helping us improving our training going forward. So would really appreciate you taking a moment to complete that. And then you have here our contact information. You have our email address, our social media, and our website. So at the website, switchboardta.org, you can submit a technical assistance request, which is, again, a request for training, additional guidance or support. If you're an OER-funded organization in any capacity, you can reach out to us, and we would love to hear from you. And again, if there were individual questions that we didn't get to, we'll try to proactively contact you as well. All right, I will close the webinar here. I see we've gone 1 minute over, apologies for that. But I'll say a huge thank you to everyone for joining today, for your active participation throughout, and of course, a big thank you to Beth Farmer and to Sasha Verbillis-Kolp for facilitating.